After Ted Cruz dropped out with Donald Trump seeming fairly triumphant yesterday, we started to wonder who is going to step up to potentially position themselves as a VP candidate alongside either Hillary or Bernie Sanders. Who is going to be the one who can actually stand against Donald Trump and attack him in a more honest way than he attacks other people, but with the same fervor that he does. And we might have had an early example of that with Elizabeth Warren going on a social media tear against Donald Trump. She tweeted this: "Real Donald Trump is now the leader of the GOP. It's real. He's one step away from the White House. Here's what else is real. Real Donald Trump has built his campaign on racism, sexism, and xenophobia. There's more enthusiasm for real Donald Trump among leaders of the KKK than leaders of the political party he now controls." By the way, David Duke coming out with very enthusiastic words about Donald Trump today. She also tweeted, "Real Donald Trump attacks vets like Senator John McCain who were captured and puts our service members at risk by cheerleading illegal torture. And real Donald Trump puts out contradictory and nonsensical national security ideas one expert called incoherent and truly bizarre." Those were the kind words that guy had to say about Trump. And she further went on to say, and I had actually sort of forgotten about this one. This is on Facebook. "He incites supporters to violence, praises Putin, and according to a columnist who recently interviewed him, is cool with being called an authoritarian and doesn't mind associations with history's worst dictators." So it's all true.
It is so weird. So she didn't attack him on his stance on fracking or international trade deals. Or I said it's so weird. Or
maybe
her tax
it was another
policy,
tweet I didn't see.
Or the way he feels about money in politics. It's weird that she didn't attack him. In fact, she's doing all those same attacks she could have done if she was campaigning to be the vice president for John Kasich. So, and it's those are that's. I just want to make that point. It's really obvious, and it's low-hanging fruit to attack Donald Trump, and it's real easy, and it's not courageous, and it doesn't take guts. And all she's doing
here. Well, apparently it takes some, since so few Democrats have been willing to do it as bluntly as she has. I mean, even Hillary Clinton today was asked, "Do you agree that he's a sexist and a racist?" And she says, "I'll let Elizabeth Warren speak for herself."
Yeah, well, just because Hillary Clinton is extra gutless doesn't mean that it takes guts to say these things.
By the way, I don't think 6 months from now, if we sit around this table, the three of us together, there will be no lack of saying these things about Donald Trump in the next 6 months.
But we've also learned this year that waiting hurts.
Yes.
Well, perhaps. I'm just saying, perhaps waiting does hurt, and I'm not disagreeing with that. But we're all going to be sick of hearing about this stuff about Donald Trump at a certain point.
So
probably.
I just think it's what do you think? I mean, what I just made my point clear. I mean, I think she's running for vice president, Hillary Clinton, whatever this is all, but it doesn't matter. Donald Trump is not going to be president. It doesn't matter.
I agree.
Well, I'm not saying that I disagree necessarily, but I haven't actually heard you say that before. So why do you think there's no chance?
I mean, I don't want to pimp the next story, but there's all the.
Oh, I see what you're saying. Okay.
Yeah, I mean.
Yeah, that's interesting. Okay, well, then we're going to get to that soon, but do you think...
I don't think you're pimping the next
Or step
story.
on it. I didn't want to step on it.
I'd like to pimp, actually.
It's just, again, Hillary's the luckiest candidate in a sense because she's running against the only other politicians with higher negatives than hers. And his own party are already coming out publicly. I mean, mainstays. That's not happening in the Democratic Party where so you have fringe guys like me saying shit like that, but you don't have, elected officials.
I've seen the growth on your YouTube channel. You're not friends. So let me ask you a question. So look, I think you're totally right. The particular things that she was attacking him on are, of course, avoiding the weak points of Hillary Clinton.
Yes.
But that said, if it was up to you and if you could press a button and choose who the VP was going to be, if Hillary is the nominee, I mean, it's not going to be Bernie, most likely. So if it's not, and it's not going to be Larry Lessig or something like that, I mean, isn't she one of the best that we could hope for?
Your reflex is, yes, that would be so much better. So we'd have her there, and she would be in Hillary's ear. Whether that matters, I don't know. But again, there's this other theory that would hurt. I think it would then just, a Hillary presidency is worse for the progressives than actually a Trump presidency because a lot of people in the mainstream are even saying that even this election, he could flip the House against the Republicans. So if he gets in and he's neutered, there's a Democratic House and a Democratic Senate, and then in 4 years we switch it again. I think there's a case to be made that it's better for progressives. And if Hillary gets that, and then she brings Elizabeth Warren and corrupts her in that way, there's no way Hillary's going to become a progressive. Tom Hartman's idea that FDR wasn't until it's just such a pipe dream. We've got 30 years on her now. We know who she is. That's not going to happen. She's not going to become a progressive. Anyway. I'll just stop there, Michael.
Well, I thanks for not pimping me. I think that first of all, I don't think Elizabeth Warren's going to be the vice presidential nominee. I don't think Bernie Sanders will be the vice presidential nominee.
Wait, is that gut, or is that based on conversations with people who? Blah, blah, blah?
It's gut, but the conversations I have with anybody else are no different than the conversations I have with any you guys. I mean, you know,
probably
as much
more
as the people.
Intelligent.
Yeah, but not Jimmy.
He's a smart guy.
But
Jimmy Millions.
Yeah.
So who do you think it's going to be?
Who do I think that? I mean, if she decides, I think there are a few people that people have talked about. Obviously, Julian Castro is one person that people have talked about. People have not talked as much about Thomas Perez, but Thomas Perez.
Not familiar with Thomas.
Well, you should familiarize yourself with him because he is the type of Secretary of Labor, the type of person who is very progressive, Latino. It's a name you will have, many people will have heard here first, but a lot of you haven't. I mean, people know who he is. That's the kind of progressive that she might lean toward, or she might go for a governor of a state that's important to get.
So you
oh
don't
my
think
God,
she's
you
going to
just
go?
gave me a terrible thought.
What's that thought?
What if one of the reasons John Kasich had to leave is so that he can begin campaigning alongside Hillary Clinton?
No, he's not going to do that. He's not going to. Because
John
he and
Kasich
Ted
could pull
Strickland.
Republicans.
No,
They would almost certainly win.
Chris Matthews.
Okay, sorry.
Literally recommended.
He did.
He said Hillary Clinton.
Of course,
if
but
she
that's
was
Chris
smart.
Matthews because Chris Matthews has high energy about this stuff and loves this fantasy. It's not going to happen. She's not. And if she crosses the border to a Republican, which she will not do, it's not going to be John Kasich either. They're just too divergent.
So you don't think
she's a real
she's
conservative.
So you don't think there's a chance in hell she picks? Well, what if she picks an independent? What if she goes that like a Lincoln
Lieberman.
Chafee or something
No,
crazy?
she's going to
Should avoid
pick. She's
scandal.
going to pick a Democrat. She's going to pick a fairly liberal Democrat, or she's going to pick a Democrat from a strategic state where that Democrat could deliver the state
Like
if
Sherrod
it's in
Brown?
question. Sherrod Brown would be a great one for her. Because of Ohio, I mean, the geography of it. He doesn't present as a vice president, and people have in mind what a vice president looks like and is like. I mean, Dick Cheney apart from that. But somebody like Tom Vilsack, Secretary of Agriculture from Iowa, a state that's going to be important. But you also have to see how this campaign now, as let's say, presumptive nominee Donald Trump and likely nominee Hillary Clinton, as they engage and as the electorate, in these ensuing months or ensuing weeks come together, you have to see sort of what people are saying. If people are recoiling at Donald Trump everywhere, then it doesn't matter who she picks for vice president. First of all, it doesn't matter anyway because nobody votes for the vice president. But if she needs to appease people in order to get past something, then you go in that direction.
I do think. Look, her choosing, theoretically, Elizabeth Warren, I think some progressives will be happy at that. I mean, I don't know enough about, I'm not the political historian that you are to know exactly, going back, how much influence they've actually had. I mean, there's cases like Dick Cheney where they seem to have had a lot of influence.
Well, they had influence once they were
Biden,
vice president.
Know.
Well, Joe Biden and the president
are
very close. I mean, for example, Donald Trump is going to pick somebody like a John Kasich who can go to Congress and knows how to navigate Congress because he doesn't. George W. Bush knew very little. He thought by having a former secretary, a chief of staff, and a congressman in Dick Cheney that, hey, that's going to be somebody who's going to help me on the Hill. And that doesn't always work either. Barack Obama selected Rahm Emanuel to be his chief of staff. That was a disastrous pick. Yeah, he knew the Congress. Everyone in the Congress hated him. Yeah, so that's the wrong person to pick. He was from Illinois, and that happens sometimes too, like the president was. But when you look at what a vice president brings, you have to, let's say all of a sudden Donald Trump is doing so poorly that a state like Mississippi comes into play for the Democrats, which is not so far-fetched, right? Because they have a lot of black voters who are very active there. They have liberal white Democrats who are, the Democrats there are liberal white Democrats. They could go into Mississippi and say, hey, there might be somebody in this state, a former governor, a former congressman, Mike Espy, I'm just thinking out loud right now. None of these people are likely, but you look at a state like Mississippi, you say, oh, we might be able to pick that off and make the Republicans look bad and spread our Democratic message into a place like Mississippi.
Hey, Michael, this is Haley Barber.
Haley Barber. Haley and Hillary.
I think from Trump's point of view, him and Kasich have bickered less than Trump and most Republicans at this point, and it would help him with some Republicans. I think that choosing Elizabeth Warren would, some progressives would like that, but also perhaps more importantly, and for the same reason that I said Ted Cruz made a good move by choosing Carly Fiorina, not that it was actually going to help him, but if you simply have now not just Hillary, but Elizabeth Warren, Donald Trump, he's salivating. He cannot not attack them in disgusting,
Yes.
low-down,
Oh,
brutal
yes.
ways.
Yeah.
Two women
Oh.
who think they can be both president and vice president, he is going to break his phone tweeting insults at them. And that could theoretically lose him the election right there because he has done worse when he's reminded people of what a despicable little child he is.
And his tweeting and childishness, and not to say that he's childish at all, Al Franken becomes appealing too because he's somebody who could get into that repartee. He's a liberal senator, liberal senator from Minnesota. Very substantive, very smart, very liberal, very caustic when he wants to be.
Could
though
needle
he doesn't
him.
engage. Yeah, but could play that game with him. But again, nobody cares about the vice president. The vice president and the presidential nominee don't get into it that much anyway. You didn't see Joe Biden and Mitt Romney going at it.
That's true, but I think with Trump and a female VP or like theoretically a Muslim VP, like that, she doesn't have to do anything.
Yeah.
He will do the damage to himself, I think.
The chance, yes, but I would say it's unlikely. Just this is my gut speaking that two women are going to be on the same ticket when the Democrats feel like why take a risk if it's Donald Trump and you think you could win anyway? Don't do anything crazy. I think a lot of people would tell that to Hillary Clinton if she's the nominee, not to do anything crazy because if you do something crazy, why mess with something that seems so automatic? You know?
So, what's the under/over on how many times, if it's a Elizabeth Warren Hillary Clinton ticket, under/over how many times Trump mentions menstrual cycles?
Well,
Drops
they're
the C
both
word.
post-menopausal, so probably not at all.
Yeah, they might skate by.
Yeah, they'll be fine.
Good point.